Good morning. Welcome to the second part of the Homelessness and Safeguarding briefings. My name's Jill Taylor and I'm the Strategic Lead for Single Homelessness and Vulnerable Adults at Haringey Council. The objectives of today's session are the second bullet points that you'll be able to see on this slide with the ring around it. So we'll do a little recap on the previous sessions with the top 3 bullet points, but today we're going to focus more specifically on practice. So some of the issues that are affecting homeless people, and then looking at some examples of that, and then talking through some good individual and multi-agency practice about working with people who are vulnerable and at risk. And then lastly, we'll talk about some resources and tools that are available to you for further reading. So to recap where we were last time, we focused on a number of different things. I'm just going to take you through a few slides now with some of the key points. So we talked a lot around the factors and the triggers to homelessness, and in particular thinking about homelessness as having 3 different elements. So individual circumstances that affect a person's life, and then the local systems and services around that person. So the safety net, if you like, that happens at a local level. So you could think about that in relation to the housing policies that your local authority has, the availability of housing and support services that people might need, and things like landlord licensing and houses of multiple occupation, etc. And then also structural and social factors. So they're the things affecting everybody in a society. So access to support from welfare benefits, housing supply, immigration policies, poverty and exclusion being examples of that. In the next slide, we talked also a lot about the impact of early childhood and the effect of adverse childhood experiences in particular, and the way that people who are or survivors of adverse childhood experiences might relate to those experiences through trauma. We talked quite a bit about how trauma can affect people's behaviour many, many years later and throughout the course of their lives, and perhaps in ways that they don't necessarily even recognise. And you can see on the slide there all sorts of different things that we talked about around adopting new coping mechanisms, experiencing difficulty managing emotions and behaviour, likelihood that relationships are challenging and that are hard to maintain, and also experience of sensitivity and irritability around different situations that happen. And the reason I'm recapping these slides in particular is because when we get to the second part of this presentation, it'll be important for us to reflect on some of the reasons why people end up in the situations they do and why they behave in the way that they do when things happen to them. So I do encourage you to think about some of these as we go on later. We also talked about the effects of homelessness on somebody's life, and in particular about the experience of stigma and prejudice, which is the way that people are treated by someone because of their preconceived ideas about what it is that they are doing, experiencing. And we talked about what that looks like in relation to the way that professionals relate to people who are homeless or who have complex needs and experiences. So things like describing someone's experience of homelessness as a lifestyle choice, and how that stigmatizes a person and makes them responsible for what is inevitably a traumatic experience in their life. We talked about some of the things around assumptions about a person's behaviour, assumptions about criminality, disbelief. We talked about the failure to recognise that certain behaviours might be coping mechanisms. And we talked about also things like capacity, both the failure to recognise issues of capacity and the overuse of capacity as a reason to make decisions about a person's life. We also touched on relevant bits of legislation. In particular, we talked about the Homelessness Reduction Act and the CARE Act. And I've highlighted here some words on the slides that are particularly important, I think, for today's session in terms of what the CARE Act offers us by way of powers or responsibilities to support people that are vulnerable. So one of the things that the CARE Act did, which was really different and quite a game-changing piece of legislation, was to promote the idea of well-being. So beyond just thinking about a person's needs for material security or to have their health issues addressed, it's also looking at a person's experience of their life, having relationships and feeling good and feeling like they contribute to the world around them. Also, it encourages integration of care and support with health services and also with housing services. So for the first time, it's a piece of legislation that says that all of the things in a person's life affect their ability to remain well and to experience positive well-being. So that idea of integration between professionals and organisations is also really key in the Care Act. Importantly, it also talks about advice. And I think one of the things about this that I often reflect on is that advice might not only be to service users or their families, it might also be to other professionals and agencies that are working with somebody who would benefit from your insights. And finally, cooperation. The key sort of thread running through the whole of the Care Act is working in partnership. And again, that means working with professionals, with agencies, with people themselves, with their family members and peers. So thinking about how do we cooperate, how do we work in a collegiate way to achieve the best outcomes for a person that has them at the centre of that. And just to draw attention to probably the most important aspects of the Care Act for the purpose of this presentation. So this Section 42 of the Care Act requires that local authorities make inquiries about an adult who it thinks is experiencing or is at risk of abuse and neglect. So it's really important. Those inquiries should establish if action needs to take place, what can be done to prevent it, and who should be involved in doing that. But importantly, it isn't something which should happen by itself or should supersede any other work taking place. It should be alongside other support that's available to somebody and other potentially statutory measures that might be in place to keep people safe. And so I think it's important that we don't think about safeguarding as a standalone process. It's something that we're all responsible for and that we're all inevitably involved in all aspects of our lives. And then the second part of the Act in Section 44 is about safeguarding adults' reviews. And so that is a review that takes place when a person dies or experiences significant abuse or neglect. And typically, these reviews take place when a person has died in a local area, and it looks at, importantly, what could be learned, what could have been done differently, and what should we do next time to prevent the same situation happening again. And this is particularly important when thinking about homelessness, because as we know, significant numbers of people die on the streets and in hostels every year. And until recently, there's been very little public or national awareness of that. And so it's important that we think about what our relationship to keeping people safe is when we think about preventing deaths, and particularly premature and early deaths. Safeguarding is defined by the Care and Support Guidance as protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. It's about preventing and responding to concerns of abuse. And I think it's important here to think about, in particular, that idea of prevention. How is it that we can keep people safe so that we're not necessarily forced to think about something as a formal safeguarding issue? And what can we do in respect of known risks or issues that someone might be experiencing to keep them more safe, or to acknowledge the things that they're doing themselves to make them feel safe? And the second bullet point here, just talk about what it is that defines an adult at risk. So importantly, it's somebody who's 18 years or older, has or is believed to have care and support needs, and they are assessed care and support needs as defined by the Care Act. It's someone who's experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect and is unable to protect themselves from that experience because of the care and support needs they have. So, for example, that might be an adult who has a learning disability, who perhaps unable to identify that somebody in their life is being abusive towards them because of the way that they form relationships. It could also be someone's experience of mental health, meaning that they don't have the capacity to make the right decisions and other people are making decisions for them that are making them unsafe. So now we're going to move on to talking about the safeguarding concerns that affect homeless people. And firstly, I want to talk about the safeguarding principles. And I think it's important that we think about these principles in relation to everybody that we work with. So although we're specifically talking about homeless people today, in fact, and we might look at these principles and think, oh, well, for homeless people, perhaps it's more about prevention than it is about partnership, or it's more about proportionality than it is about protection. But it's important that when we think about making people safe and responding to safeguarding concerns in our practice, that we think about all 6 of these principles and how we work within them to keep people safe who are vulnerable or within our care. But I do just want to draw attention in particular to the idea of empowerment, and relating back to the slides on stigma and prejudice. One of the key experiences that people who are rough sleeping in particular, who have long histories of homelessness, face is disempowerment. Their decisions are often taken away from them. They've offered very few choices about where they want to live, how they want to live, and who they want to receive support from. So the idea of empowering people to make their own choices, enabling them to take control of their own lives, and make decisions which we might disagree with, I think is really key here to thinking about how do we keep people safe when perhaps we might not be able to always offer them all of the things that we know might do that. So no doubt people will be familiar with the different forms of abuse. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide for too long, but I think it's just important to think about the relationship that people have to abuse and neglect, and the understanding that we have to it. It's not only interpersonal abuse between two people who know each other very well. It can also be abuse experienced as part of residing in an institution or being cared for by an organisation. It can also be, and importantly, is neglects and acts of omission, so things that are not done that put people at risk. And self-neglect, which is often a very complex idea to understand, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. So it's worth bearing in mind that a whole range of different forms of potential abuse could be affecting, or neglect could be affecting a person at any given time, and that neither one is more important or more harmful than the other. Homeless people are not more likely to experience one particular form of abuse or neglect than anybody else. And what that means is that they're especially vulnerable to all forms of abuse due to the experience of homelessness itself. But there isn't one particular thing which they're more likely to experience. All forms of violence and neglectful behaviour are exacerbated by the experience of being on the street in particular, but in all forms of temporary accommodation or hidden homelessness, there's a likelihood that the experience of abuse and neglect is made worse by that, often because a person might not be able to leave the situation they're in because they don't have any choices. It's particularly likely that people who are homeless and in rough sleeping, perhaps with complex needs, might never have had those care and support needs identified. And so one of the issues around abuse and neglect within the homeless population is that they might not be recognised as an adult at risk, and that the delays in making those assessments might mean that they are left in an unsafe situation for much longer periods of time. Another compounding factor is that people with histories of homelessness, as we've talked about before, often have experienced repeat instances of exploitation, abuse and neglect since their childhoods, and often feel that they've been let down by statutory and voluntary organisations trying to support them. They often feel that they have reported experiences in the past and not been believed, or there hasn't been the sort of justice that they were hoping for, and that anything that they now do to talk about an experience they might be facing will either put them at greater risk of harm because nobody will do anything, or they'll be less likely to be believed because perhaps if they're using drugs or if they have a mental health issue, they'll feel that their account will not be believed to be credible. I think it's really important, not only when working with homeless people, but in particular when working with people facing homelessness and the levels of social exclusion that come with that, that we think about the range of issues that might prevent people from being able to tell the truth about something that's happening to them. Often homelessness is associated with self-neglect, and I think I wanted to have a slide on it, perhaps because it's such a complex area, and I think there's many, many slides we could have to talk about some of the experiences and some of the ways of understanding self-neglect. One thing that I really wanted to highlight is that it can be a cause, a trigger, or an effect of homelessness. So somebody can find themselves homeless, perhaps because they've experienced self-neglect for such a long time. They may well have been hoarding and been asked to leave their home. It can be a trigger. So, for example, again, thinking about hoarding and self-neglect, environmental health may well have made them homeless because their property needed to be emptied or cleared, or they were asked to leave by a family member. And it can also be an effect of homelessness. Rough sleeping and the sort of severe levels of trauma and emotional distress experienced by people rough sleeping can lead to people being in a position of self-neglect, no longer caring for their appearance, their physical health, where they're sleeping. And it can look like a number of different things, but in effect, it can often come across as someone's inability to keep themselves safe or healthy or clean, failure to seek support when they need it, and an unwillingness to engage with professionals or manage person's personal affairs. And it's a very complex area because it's actually quite difficult to pinpoint what caused it or where it came from. It's often associated with mental health, but it can actually be a result of all sorts of different things, including brain injuries, physical illnesses, side effect of medication, generally as a response to traumatic life events. Not everyone who self-neglects will require Care Act intervention. Some people may well not have other needs and can be supported through other services or through relationships that they build to start to take better care of their own lives. But for some people, for various reasons, often including the sort of comorbidity of drug dependency, mental health, perhaps the experiences of violence elsewhere in their lives, will be eligible for support and will need intervention from others. And one of the things that I think is really important with thinking about self-neglect is the issue and the idea, the importance of time. People experiencing self-neglect are known not to respond to reactive interventions. So, for example, if we think about the experience of hoarding, which is often associated with self-neglect, whilst we could go into someone's house, clear all of their belongings, and think that we'd solved the problem, what's actually been shown is that that doesn't have very much effect on that person's hoarding at all. And in fact, the distress that it causes and the distance between that person and the trust that they have for a professional can often mean that their self-neglect becomes worse afterwards. So the importance here of relational approaches, thinking about how do we build trust between the people that we work with so that they might feel that they're able to talk about things that are difficult for them or concerns that they have about their safety or their well-being is really important. So thinking about forms of abuse which are interpersonal, so between individuals, as opposed to the forms of abuse or neglect which might come from an organisation. One of the things that I think is really important to think about is the relationships that people form. Often people form difficult, traumatic, codependent relationships because both people are in very difficult situations, and being with somebody else helps to keep people feeling more safe, even if that relationship is violent or exploitative in some way. So I think it's really key that we recognise that although we might be able to work with somebody and see quite clearly that somebody that they associate with puts them at risk, they may well feel that actually that person offers them safety. And there's a complexity there in supporting a person to think about how it is they could feel safe and at the same time move away from the experience of abuse that they might be facing. There are some people who are homeless who find themselves at a particular risk. So women, learning disabled people, transgender people face particular risks of abuse when they seek safety from street homelessness, often resulting in exploitation and sexual abuse, people sleeping in unsafe places to avoid being on the streets, and making themselves less visible to people who might keep them safe. It's also worth pointing out that in recent years it's become clear that gangs and drug dealers particularly target people who are rough sleeping. You might know the phrase county lines in relation to young people, but we're increasingly hearing reports from people who are homeless who are also being asked to take drugs up and down the country, and their vulnerability and their need for money or more drugs to feed their own addictions means that they're particularly vulnerable to that. And they're also less likely to be missed and reported missing. And that's something, again, to be very mindful of when working with someone who might be street homeless. Another thing is that many, up to 60% of people who are street homeless have long-term physical health conditions, which often means that they have prescription medication, sometimes which is of high value. So, for example, painkillers, benzodiazepines such as diazepam, and that can make them a target for other people who might want those drugs. And that might leave that person not only without the medication that they need, but also as a known target for people in the future. We mentioned in the previous presentation that domestic abuse is a particularly common experience with street homeless population, with more than 60% of women who are homeless having experienced domestic abuse in the past and whilst homeless, which is more than twice as much as in the general population. And again, I think going back to the previous slide, we talked about relational approaches and the importance of curiosity, asking people what it is that makes them feel safe about a situation and what makes them feel unsafe, and building a relationship so that when they feel that they are able to talk about things that have happened to them, it's on a trusting foundation. And often knowing that people who are homeless have repeated their life stories over and over and over again means that people feel quite jaded and can often talk about very, very distressing things with what seems like a fairly limited emotional response. And as professionals, it's important for us to recognise that, in fact, that's likely a coping mechanism, and that it doesn't mean that they're unaffected by the things that are happening to them, or that they're not afraid. And so, again, thinking about how are we asking questions to understand a person's experience, and in particular, recognising that they might be at risk of many forms of abuse at the same time. So we're now going to try an exercise. So when I do this presentation in person, we would be sitting in groups and having a discussion about the case studies that you're about to see. But for the purpose of this, I will read out the case study and then encourage you to ask any questions through the message board about what you've read. Make any suggestions that you might have about what you would do if you met this person, how you think you might help resolve what's going on for them, and where you see the role of safeguarding. So I welcome any thoughts on the next couple of slides. So the first person that we're going to get to know is Ade. Ade is well known to homelessness mental health services, has been experiencing mental health difficulties for a number of years, but hasn't been received any support or treatment for quite a while. He's been diagnosed with schizophrenia and experiences this as auditory hallucinations and paranoia, which he feels that he manages fine by himself. He's recently been evicted from a hostel where he'd been staying for 2 years, and that was the longest home that he'd sustained in quite a long time. He was then evicted after getting involved in a fight with another resident and is currently street homeless. When you ask him about it, he says that the other person was violent towards him and that he's really disappointed that he was evicted and that he was so quick to be blamed for the fight when he hasn't been involved in any fights before. The outreach team, who are now working with him on the street, are very worried because they're quite concerned that his mood and behaviour seem to have deteriorated quite rapidly and that he is experiencing unusual beliefs again, and they're worried about him. They raised a safeguarding alert because he was taken to the hospital by police after he was found on the streets having overdosed on heroin. He's never known to have used IV drugs before, and there are concerns that he might not have done so voluntarily. So I encourage anyone here to think about, have you ever met a person like this? What are the things that spring to mind? What are the issues that might be affecting Ade? And when we have this presentation in person, I also encourage people to think about what isn't being said here, what's missing, what would you like to know about Ade that you don't currently know? And what sorts of questions would you, as a practitioner, in whatever field you're in, be asking either of Ade or of the organisations that you can see he's been working with here? So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to have either chat amongst yourselves or a few thoughts about this, and then do add any questions that you might have. So we've had some interesting comments and questions so far. One thing that people have asked is who's involved. So it says a safeguarding alert has been raised and there's outreach services, but is there someone who's working with Ade really well, has a good relationship with him? Which is a really important question, because often somebody will have a relationship with one particular person, and that might be someone they trust and that they've worked with for a long time. And so there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel and decide that somebody else will take the lead. And sometimes there's an opportunity to think about how we might build on and strengthen a relationship that somebody has with a particular professional, rather than start something all over again. Another thing that people have been concerned about is the last statement of whether or not he's taken those drugs voluntarily and what we might do to find that out. And often in safeguarding alerts and queries and concerns, there are a lot of unanswered questions. But the first place that we can start is by asking Ade himself, if we're able to visit him in hospital or we're able to meet with him afterwards, and try to find out from him what it is that's going on. How is his mental health? How is he feeling? It's not always necessary to try to assume information from what we can get from other professionals. And in doing that, we often neglect to understand the detail of what's happening in a person's life. And another thing that I wanted to point out here is the case study of Ade that I've created is very much a stereotype. And I really wanted to kind of bring attention to the idea that we might repeatedly hear the same words and experiences about particular people. So Black men with mental health needs being described as violent, finding themselves evicted from accommodation much quicker and in much less severe circumstances than other people because of presumptions about their behaviour. So one of the key things I think when we're thinking about meeting anybody new is that we challenge some of those assumptions and that we resist falling into stereotypical ways of thinking about people, in particular as it might relate to their race or their gender or disability or sexuality. So thank you. So moving on to the second case study, this is Erica. So Erica is in her 30s, we think, and has been sleeping rough in Haringey for the last few months. She's quite elusive and the street outreach team don't really know very much about her, except that she's from Lithuania. Other people living on the street have said they think she has a learning disability, but you don't know any more about that at this point. And Erica approaches one of the outreach team one day and says that she's worried about someone is going to hurt her because she knows she owes them money. She's noticeably less well presented than the last time and seems confused, but when asked, she won't say any more about the money or anything else. The outreach worker notices that her stomach is protruding and asks her if she could be pregnant. Erica picks up a bag and walks off. So again, it'd be really interesting for you to think now, what does this make you think about? What are the questions you would want the answers to? And how might you help to make Erica safer? And where do you think the kind of key lines of inquiry would be in doing that? So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to think about that, and then I'll come back and answer some questions on this. Some thoughts that we've had here is that we don't know very much about Erica at all, and that people are saying, well, we don't know enough to know whether or not she has a learning disability or is at risk or is unsafe. And so the first thing will be to try and find out if there is anybody who knows anything more about her, or if we can find a way of asking her questions. Somebody mentioned that the outreach worker asking her if her is pregnant is a little bit rude, and that might have put her off. There's all sorts of reasons why her stomach might be protruding. She might be unwell, for example. So I think that's really important in picking up the relationship that professionals have with their work. And we forget often that just because we've asked a question 1,000 times doesn't mean that the person receiving it is going to be in the place to hear it. So there's something about how we act with sensitivity and how we think about how we build relationships before we expect people to talk to us about the detail of their lives. And no more is that the case for people who might be experiencing rough sleeping or might have had multiple stays in institutions, for example, and feel untrusting of practitioners. People have also mentioned the fact that she's Lithuanian, and knowing that this now means that she might not have her settled status in the UK, and that might mean she's ineligible to receive welfare benefits or to access forms of statutory services. So there's an immediate question about how eligible is Erica for further support. Many of you will know that the Care Act is legislation that's universal to everybody in the country. So regardless of her immigration status, she has a right to access an assessment and support for any care and support needs she might have. But at the moment, we don't know if she has any. There are lots of issues potentially in relation to exploitation here. Again, the fact that she is from Lithuania and other EU countries, we know that there are a number of women who experience modern slavery and trafficking from countries in Eastern Europe into the UK. And although there's no evidence here that that is the case, it's something that we should consider as a line of inquiry to try to understand who it might be that's exploiting Erica, and if there are places where she feels safe or unsafe, and how we might help her feel more safe in the relationship or the conversations that we're having with her. And of course, if she is pregnant, there's a question of her ongoing health and maternity care, and how we might offer her that. So there's a lot going on here. And at the moment, one thing that we're unsure of is if there's anybody else who might be supporting her. The Street Outreach Service are the only organisation mentioned here, and they admittedly don't have a particularly good relationship with her and haven't met her many times. So I think, again, this relates to the idea of curiosity and how it is that we want to understand the people that we might be supporting or that we might be assessing. And again, Erica is also, in many respects, a stereotype. There are lots of ways that we can view a person, and even the suggestion that she might be somebody who's experienced human trafficking in and of itself is potentially looking for an experience in a particular group of people that we may not be looking for in other people. So the experience of trafficking, although we know it is common for people from particular groups, it's also increasingly common for people, for example, in the country who are British nationals, to be experiencing trafficking within the country. So it's important that we don't only ask certain questions of certain people, and that we challenge some of those stigmas, some of those prejudices that we might have about particular people as we're working with them. Many of you will have undoubtedly been talking about all kinds of different good practice when you were having those conversations, or when you were thinking for yourself about what you might do to keep Erica and Ade safe. And so we're just now going to go through some good individual practice around working with homeless people, and then some good multi-agency practice. So many of you showed professional curiosity in asking questions and thinking about, how did Ade and Erica get into this place? What's going on for them that means that they are experiencing rough sleeping at the moment, and that's making them feel unsafe or unhappy in their current circumstances? Where did they come from? Understanding people's stories, which often takes perseverance and being non-judgmental, building trust and having a positive regard for people despite the difficulties that they might be talking to you about, or the behaviour that they might be displaying, which is challenging for you as a professional. It's really important, particularly with people with long histories of homelessness, that we understand some of the things that for them are the key points in their life. Often people that I have met will talk about something which might have happened 20 years before, and that is the thing that they see as the trigger to their experience of homelessness, and that without coming to some resolution or some sense of healing from that, everything else that happens afterwards will continue happening. So that sense of understanding a person's story in a way which is meaningful for them, rather than it is a way that is meaningful simply for you as a professional, is really important. Making safeguarding personal. Many of you will know about this in detail. There are a number of webinars and the conferences that you can go to that will teach you about this in detail. But really, it's about making the person who is at risk at the centre of the work that you're doing to keep them safe. Giving people choices about what they want to do, asking them questions about the things that they do already, and involving them in any actions that you might take around their safety. It's really important to maintaining trust, and ultimately it's important to empowering people to recognise when they are at risk themselves. And that requires flexibility. So be flexible in how you work with people. If you can be, offer opportunities to meet in different places at different times and for different lengths of time to suit that person, rather than trying to fit people in to what might be quite rigid administrative boundaries that you might have. And that is really challenging. We all face a lot of different pressures at work and have a lot of different demands on our time. But often when we're supporting someone with a range of different complex needs, the time that we don't put in at the start, we will have to put in the end anyway. So it's important that we think about, actually, how do we invest in this person in a way that's meaningful for them, so that we can hopefully work with them more meaningfully over a long period of time. Or second to last, understanding the housing legislation and the person's housing history is really important, partly because being legally literate means that you might be able to challenge decisions that have been made about their homelessness, but it also means that you'll understand what they might be eligible for and how that might come about. And understanding their housing history will give you really good insight into whether or not they have lived independently before, where they might have been able to maintain that, and where they've experienced difficulties in their housing situation. And that might include getting to know local services and pathways of support available. So trying to understand what support might be available within the voluntary sector, grassroots homelessness organisations working in your borough. It's really important to giving people choices about the sorts of support that they can get. This is around multi-agency practice. So we will all hear in all sorts of different experiences and meetings and things that we're involved in and bits of work that we do. Working together is the most important thing that we do. Working in partnership, working collaboratively. There's a lot of different ways that we describe this kind of work. And I think that one thing that's really important about it is that we don't overcomplicate it. For the most part, good multi-agency practice is purely and simply about communicating with other people that might be working with somebody. So I've written here, don't be afraid to be curious. So as a group of professionals, and not only as an individual, asking questions about what the other people might know about the person, the relationships they have with them, what might have worked well before in supporting them, is really important to do. And also bearing in mind that that curiosity might also sometimes be met with, I'm sorry, but I can't share that with you because of a confidential conversation that's had in another area. I think it's important that we also respect people's privacy. Identifying a lead practitioner. So with ADE, we were aware there was a number of different organisations involved, and that perhaps he had a relationship with one of those people or organisations which was particularly strong and beneficial to him, and that he felt was more important than others. So identifying someone who might be the lead for a piece of work that's taking place across agencies is really helpful. It means that communication can be streamlined and everybody knows who the person is to go to talk to about the person as a priority. Identifying other key contacts. So there might be family members, there might be friends, there might be partners who you should be asking about and involving in conversations that you're having. Informed consent. So this is particularly important beyond the legislative requirements which we all have to meet. It's particularly important when working with someone who's vulnerable or experiencing abuse and neglect, because trust and the breakdown of trust is often a key element in the things they've experienced. So ensuring that they understand what information you have about them, how it will be shared, and that they are making choices as far as possible about how that will happen is really important. Now, of course, there will be times where information has to be shared to keep a vulnerable person safe, which is beyond their consent. But where possible, we should be still ensuring that we're telling people what we're doing and why we're doing it as far as we can. Sharing expertise is really important, and in particular doing so by getting together in meetings. It might be online meetings or by telephone or in person, but having the opportunity as professionals to meet each other, share our concerns, share our knowledge and insight is really, really valuable, even if that often results in making a decision jointly that we might have made as an individual. The information and the way that we'll feel about working together is much stronger when in partnership. And then lastly, thinking about information sharing protocols. So if we're working across organisations, it can often be difficult to share information safely and with consent because we have different ways of thinking about how information is stored and what it is that we should be doing with that information as either the controller of it. So having awareness that there are information sharing protocols in place between most statutory organisations and voluntary organisations, and if you can find copies of them and understand what can be shared and in what circumstances, that can often be really helpful. And then finally, thinking about that, are there opportunities to do assessments or meetings together? So if two organisations want to understand about a person's support needs or their housing situation, rather than asking that person to meet you twice, why don't you not do the assessment together? And in that way, you also learn from other professionals' assessment styles and ways of working. For me, there's three kind of things here that are really important, which will run through everything that we do. And this is not only relevant to people who are homeless, but in the context of this, that's where I framed it. So related to curiosity, thinking about asking. So always ask questions of other practitioners, ask questions of the person, ask questions of your own practice. What can I help with? How did you end up here? How does your living situation affect your health? What would you do if you felt unsafe? Are you prescribed any medication? All sorts of questions that might lead you to understand more about the person's situation, more about the risks they might be experiencing, and importantly, about the skills they have in managing their own safety and identifying the things that are going on for them. And equally, understanding what their priorities are, which may well be in contrast to yours. Secondly, to act. Acting doesn't always mean taking full responsibility for a person's life, for their care, or acknowledging that they are eligible for the service that you provide. It might mean seeking out another organisation or professional that can help you. It might mean making a street link referral to report somebody who is rough sleeping so that they can receive support from the outreach team. It might be asking your manager or a colleague for some advice, or sharing advice with another person in your team. There's a lot of different ways that we can take action to address someone's risks and vulnerabilities that look very different in different organisations and for different people. And then finally, advocate. And I don't mean this in the sense of formal advocacy, although if there are advocacy organisations in your borough or working with people that you're supporting, then that's great. But really, I mean advocate in the sense that understanding what a person might be entitled to, and I've written here, legal literacy goes a long way. Understanding what the law says about your work and the work of other people you might be working with, and how that affects the person you're supporting. Ask for reconsiderations of decisions that have been made, particularly if you think that somebody's needs or risks weren't identified properly. Particularly if we think about someone who's homeless, asking for a reconsideration of a housing decision, if we feel that there's information to be added, can be really valuable. And doing that in partnership with the housing office that you have in your borough can also be a really collaborative way of thinking about, well, how can housing and social care professionals work together to enable this person to move away from homelessness and into independence? And then another way that we can advocate is that we can talk about things like trauma and adverse childhood experiences and homelessness within our teams and in our workplaces, to advocate on behalf of people who may not be very well represented in the work that we do. And the top bullet point on the left-hand side there just says that we may well not always need to make formal safeguarding inquiries, and they may not even be very useful to addressing the particular issues of safety that someone might face. But that doesn't mean that there is nothing that we can or should do. And the sort of 3 A's there really give a lot of ideas about what we can do to support somebody, even when we may well not feel that we're the best organisation or practitioner to take on their case. In many boroughs, and I think in most of North London boroughs, there are some form of multi-agency panel or forum which looks at individual people who perhaps for some reason haven't been able to achieve the goals they've set for themselves, that risks haven't been reduced despite lots of different people being involved, or who are of concern for a number of reasons to a number of different organisations. Some boroughs call this high-risk panels, some boroughs have community MARACs, others have case conferences, and they're not quite the same thing. But I encourage everybody to try and find out if in your borough there is a multi-agency panel or forum that looks at high risk or safeguarding concerns, and in particular where that's around people that are experiencing a range of complex issues that need the involvement of multiple organisations. So the reason why this is not quite the same as a professionals meeting or a case conference is because the people that are usually attending multi-agency panels and forums are not necessarily working in frontline services, or might not be the key workers or lead practitioners working with a person. And instead, they're there to offer a broad discussion across a range of different organisations and partners that might be giving you information about the person that you haven't already known, that might be able to offer advice about how in their organisation you're able to access particular teams or particular forms of support, or they might suggest new lines of inquiry or activity that you can conduct that might help the person that they're able to see from their position that perhaps you're not. Importantly, these panels and forums are an opportunity to collaborate, to work together, to share tasks, to conduct joint assessments, and shouldn't be seen as a way to hand off a difficult case. And I say that because often we work in fairly limited remits. We have a job in mental health, or we have a job in learning disabilities, or we have a job in homelessness. But actually, with most of the people we're working with, they cross over multiple different boundaries, which are arbitrary, really. People's lives are very complex. but the way that we work requires us to sometimes work more simply, and that makes certain people particularly challenging to work with and to know how to support. So I definitely think that we can find ourselves frustrated as practitioners and unsure about what to do. But these sorts of forums and panels ought to be an opportunity for us to feel more supported by others. And the more strengths-based and preventative panels look at those 4 bullet points at the bottom. So they look at things like, how do we improve resilience, both within the person themselves who's experiencing abuse or neglect, and within the practitioners and other people supporting them? How do we build capacity, again in individuals or in organisations, to identify issues of safety more quickly, and to build capacity to resolve our own problems? Equally, how to build capacity around particular areas of knowledge and ways of working. How do we understand coping mechanisms and protective factors? So rather than only looking at safeguarding as the risks that somebody faces, how do we also think about the things that they do to keep themselves safe and that have kept them safe up until this point, even where those things might be complex and we might find a coping mechanism to be unhealthy. And then finally, thinking about how do we share person-centered goals and actions. And we use the word person-centered a lot, but I think in particular when thinking about making safeguarding personal, this is important because we often choose not to center somebody when we think that they're at risk or when we think that they're experiencing harm. And that can be really disempowering and take away the opportunity for them to think about what is important to them and how they need to feel safe and how they want professionals to work with them. So often where you find good examples of these sorts of panels and forums, they're looking at those 4 things at the bottom. And if in your boroughs you find that you have a multi-agency panel or forum or high-risk group, I encourage you to go there, participate, take difficult cases that you're working with, people that you're finding hard to know how to support, and ask for help from others. And where you think that there's an opportunity to make it more strengths-based or to think about more preventative ways of working, encourage that in the people that you're working with on those groups as well. So we mentioned safeguarding adults reviews. Many boroughs have introduced different forms of reviews into the deaths of homeless people. This is fairly new. Previously, it's fair to say that safeguarding adults reviews haven't really taken into account the deaths of homeless people as often as they should. In the last couple of years, that has changed, and there's been a number of different reviews that have taken place into the deaths of homeless people, which are really insightful about a lot of what we've talked about in the last 2 parts of this presentation. So in Haringey, in January of last year, we introduced a homelessness fatality review procedure. And the reason I'm using Haringey as an example is because our approach has now been adopted by a number of different North London boroughs. So we're often now working quite similar ways in Camden, in Islington, and other boroughs such as Westminster as well. And the GLA have recently encouraged all London boroughs to adopt the approach that we have. So I would suggest that you try and find out if there is a review process in your borough that looks at the deaths of homeless people, and try to find out what learning has come out of those in the past, if there have been reviews. The important thing about safeguarding adults reviews and about homelessness fatality reviews is that it's an opportunity for us to learn what could have happened differently that might have prevented that person's death, that we can implement in the future to prevent deaths taking place again. And I think, unfortunately, as mentioned in part 1, it's all too often seen that the premature deaths of homeless people are somehow inevitable and that they shouldn't make us feel emotional. They should be seen as something that takes place all the time. And I would really encourage people to reflect on what that tells us about the value that we place on homeless people's lives, and to challenge the reality that homeless people should be dying 40 years younger than everybody else. And one thing that I've learned from conducting homelessness fatality reviews in Haringey is just how many opportunities there often are for practitioners to work differently and work more collaboratively, which might have identified something that someone was experiencing early enough to prevent their death. And in Haringey, one of the things that we've really tried to do around this is to make the review process really person-centered. So we've adopted a lot of what is used in the LEADER process, which is the reviews for the deaths of people who are learning disabled, to try to really make sure that we capture a portrait of that person as they would want to be seen, and not only about what's wrong with them, the deficits, the risks they experience in their life, but who they are to other people, whether they were parents or friends, the things they were interested in, the things they achieved and were good at, times in their life when they were happy. And again, the value of doing that is it also helps us identify what it is that makes people's lives more positive, what we can do to promote and develop and strengthen things that are good, and not only focus on what is negative or potentially bad. So thank you. So final slides here before a list of resources. So just for those of you who might not be familiar with homelessness services or pathways into support, if you're aware of someone who you think is rough sleeping, you can contact StreetLink. And I know that you'll probably have seen the posters and adverts about StreetLink all over London. And the phone number and the website are there. They also have an app. One of the things I would say about StreetLink is don't assume that just because somebody's in a very public place that other people have made a referral before you. It's always worth sending in a referral about somebody, because they may well have been reported before but have moved locations and so haven't been found. So please do make StreetLink referrals about anyone that you're concerned about who is rough sleeping. Secondly, the Homelessness Reduction Act brought in the duty to refer, as we talked about in part 1. Most boroughs, and I think all London boroughs, use the alert system. So if you click on that link there, you can register. And if you're a social worker or you work in hospitals or any range of statutory organisations, you can use that link to make a referral to your housing team about someone who you think is homeless, or importantly at risk of homelessness, within 56 days. So don't feel that you need to wait until someone is homeless before you make a referral. Use the alert system to make a referral as early as possible. And that will lead to an appointment with your local housing options team. It might be called a housing needs or housing solutions team in your area, and get some advice about how you might be able to prevent the person from becoming homeless or relieve the homelessness that they're currently experiencing. And then finally, Atlas, it's the London Housing Federation, essentially a map of all sorts of different services in local areas. So you can click down to your individual borough level and find out about the services that are registered in your area. And you can also look at other boroughs so that you can help somebody who may well have connections somewhere else. I'd really encourage everyone to have a look on that website. It's really useful in understanding some of the services that might be available to you that you might not know about. The last slide is a range of different resources that you can find and you can read about. I would really encourage people to read the Voices of Those with Lived Experience report, which was done in Wales. Again, thinking about the importance of making sure that it's the people who experience homelessness and safeguarding issues that are at the centre of the work we do, and not only the professionals that we work with. And the other links there are for a range of different things that we've mentioned throughout the presentation.